Today, I want to share with you a story about the kind of cold that chills you to the bone, and the kind of warmth that can save a soul. It's a story about a house that stood tall and proud in the town of Oak Hollow, a place folks like to say shone brighter than any lantern for miles around. But the folks in Oak Hollow didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the grand white house on the ridge, known as Sterling Manor, was lit not by grace or hospitality, but by a deep, festering anger. Those who lived close enough to hear the shouting behind the heavy velvet curtains knew better. They knew that inside those pristine walls, a war was being waged against a young woman named Elara Vance. Elara was 22, slight as a sapling, but bent by too many seasons of harsh wind. She wasn't the daughter of the house, not the way the world counted such things. She was the orphan taken in by Judge Josiah Sterling, a man who wore his reputation like a suit of armor. But Elara knew she hadn't been taken in out of charity. She was the living reminder of a family secret, a mistake brought into the world at the wrong time and in the wrong way. And the judge never let her forget it. Every morning, long before the sun scraped its first line of gold across the plains, Elara was already awake. Her hands were raw from scrubbing floors that were already clean, her back stiff from carrying water up and down the long, drafty hallways. She moved like a ghost in her own home, trying to be invisible, trying to be small. Breakfast was the hardest time. Beatrice Sterling, the judge's wife, would sit at the grand walnut dining table, sipping hot coffee while Elara worked around her. Beatrice was a woman with a face carved sharp as a hatchet blade, and her words cut just as deep. She would tap the rim of her china cup, her eyes narrowing as she watched Elara polish the silver. "Look at you," Beatrice would sneer. "Skinny as a fence rail and just as useless. Who could stomach raising the likes of you? If it weren't for the judge's pity, you'd be starving in a ditch." Elara kept her eyes down. She had learned years ago that answering back only meant more trouble. And in the Sterling house, trouble usually wore the face of Caleb. Caleb was the Sterling's son, 30 years old, broad-shouldered, and mean in the casual way of men who have never been punished for a single sin in their lives. He would swagger into the kitchen at noon, still smelling of stale whiskey, even though the day was half over. Every time he laid eyes on Elara, a cruel smile would crawl up his face. "Well, look, who's still breathing?" he'd mutter, grabbing her arm just hard enough to leave a bruise that she would have to hide under her sleeves. "Don't think the world owes you air, girl." Sometimes he'd shove her against the counter. Sometimes he'd yank a lock of her hair just to see her flinch. Beatrice never stopped him. And Judge Sterling, the judge never cared enough to notice. Judge Josiah Sterling still looked like the powerful man the town respected. Tall, boots shined to perfection, gray hair kept short and severe. But inside, the man had grown hollow. The town thought he was a stern man of the law, but Elara knew better. He was rotting from the shame of her existence, and that resentment had come to define him. He never raised his voice, but his quiet was its own kind of violence. His eyes were cold as winter creek water. Elara had stopped crying years ago. Pain had become a companion to her, familiar as the creak of the old stairs. The steady ache of her life had carved her down to the bone until she no longer dreamed, no longer hoped. She simply survived. Then came the evening that cracked everything open. It was deep winter. Caleb had been gambling again, cards and whiskey, out behind the livery stable in town. He had lost more money than he could pay, and the debt collectors were not kind men. He staggered home, panicked, looking for a way out. He found his solution the moment he burst into the parlor and saw Elara dusting the mantel. "There," he shouted, his hand trembling as he pointed a finger at her. "It was her. I saw her taking the gold pocket watch from Father's study this morning. She's been stealing for months. I bet. Little rats probably got a stash somewhere." Elara froze, the feather duster slipping from her numb fingers. "I didn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Caleb, you know I didn't." But Beatrice stormed across the room before Elara could finish her sentence. "You lying little tramp," she shrieked. She struck Elara across the face so hard that Elara fell to her knees on the hard wood floor. "Josiah, get in here." The judge appeared in the doorway. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark and unreadable. "She's been stealing," Caleb insisted, desperate to cover his own tracks. "I caught her. Saw her with my own eyes." The judge didn't ask how. He didn't ask when. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't even look at his son. He looked only at Elara, the girl who represented everything he hated about his past. "You ungrateful curse," he growled. Then the violence broke loose. He hit her. Not once, not twice, but again and again until the room spun, and the metallic taste of blood filled Elara's mouth. Beatrice shouted insults from the corner. Caleb kicked at her ribs while she was down. And then the judge dragged her by the arm, hauling her through the house like a sack of grain, all the way to the heavy front door. "You're done here," he said, his voice devoid of any mercy. "Get out of my house and take your filth with you." He shoved her out into the cold night. Beatrice slammed the door, and the sound of the heavy deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. Elara tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. The sky above the ridge was fading to a soft, bruised pink, and the snow had begun to fall thin, sharp flakes drifting down like ash. She was wearing nothing but her thin house dress. The cold was instant and biting, needle sharp against her bruised skin. She crawled toward the road, her breath rasping in her throat. By the time she reached the fence line, she could no longer feel her fingers. The warmth of the manor, the roaring fires, the heavy quilts, all of it was forbidden to her now. The only thing the Sterling house had given her was the heat of their rage. She collapsed in the snow beside an old, twisted cottonwood tree, her vision dimmed, the edges of the world turning gray. Her heartbeat slowed, thumping heavily in her ears. A strange, terrifying calmness settled over her. "Maybe this is the best mercy the world will ever offer me," she thought. She closed her eyes, letting the snow cover her like a shroud, waiting for the end. But the story doesn't end in the snow, because fate, it seemed, had other ideas. But fate, as it often does on the frontier, arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the rattle of a wagon wheel against the frozen earth, lying there in the snow. Elara's consciousness was fading, drifting away like smoke in the wind. She didn't hear the horse approaching at first. She didn't hear the creak of the leather harness or the soft snort of an animal laboring in the cold. But then, a voice cut through the howling wind, not a man's bark, but a woman's sharp, commanding tone, bringing a horse to a halt. "Whoa. Steady now." Boots crunched heavily through the crust of the snow. A moment later, hands were on Elara, warm, rough, capable hands. A face hovered above her, framed by a heavy wool hood. It was a face worn by years of sun and grief, etched with the kind of lines that come from squinting at hard horizons. This was Martha Higgins. The folks in Oak Hollow knew her as the widow who ran the Double Creek Ranch alone since her husband didn't come back from the war between the states. She was known for her sharp tongue, her Bible verse, and a sorrow she wore as plainly as her black coat. "Good Lord, child," Martha murmured, brushing the ice from Elara's cheek. "What have they done to you?" Elara tried to speak, to warn the woman that she was trash, that she was unwanted, but her lips only trembled. Martha didn't wait for an answer. She didn't ask who was to blame. She simply unbuttoned her heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapped it around Elara's shivering frame. With a strength that belied her age, Martha lifted Elara from the snow as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry wheat. "You're coming with me," Martha said, her voice leaving no room for argument. No one deserves to freeze alone on a night like this. The wagon ride was a blur of pain and jostling, every bump sending a fresh shock through Elara's battered ribs. She drifted in and out, aware only of Martha's arm wrapped tight around her, anchoring her to the world of the living. By the time they turned off the main road, the storm had settled into a steady, silent fall. Double Creek Ranch stretched out before them in the moonlight. It was a place of fading glory fences that leaned a little to the left, a barn that had seen better paint, and silence. So much silence. Once, this place had been a thriving operation, filled with cattle and laughter. Now, it was quiet, like a house holding its breath, waiting for a life that had ended years ago. Martha guided the horses to the front porch and helped Elara down. Elara hesitated at the bottom step, the old fear clawing at her throat. "I shouldn't be here," she rasped. Her voice cracked. "The judge," he said. "Hush now," Martha interrupted gently. "You are cold. You are hurt. That is all that matters to the Lord. And that is all that matters to me." She opened the front door, and the sensation that hit Elara was so overwhelming it nearly brought her to her knees. Warmth. Thick, radiant warmth from a cast-iron stove roaring in the hall. The air smelled of pine resin, dried sage, and soap clean. Comforting scents that wrapped around her like a second blanket. Martha led her into a sitting room lined with shelves of old books and faded photographs. She settled Elara onto a cushioned settee and bustled away, returning moments later with a basin of hot water, clean rags, and a bowl of stew that smelled of beef and potatoes. Elara stared at the bowl in her lap. Her hands were shaking so badly the spoon rattled against the ceramic. In the Sterling house, she had never been allowed to eat until the family was finished. She had subsisted on cold scraps, eaten standing up in the pantry. "I'll spill it," Elara whispered, terrified of the mess, terrified of the punishment that would surely follow. Martha sat down beside her, her expression softening into something fierce and motherly. "Then we'll clean it up," she said. "Don't fret, child. Eat." Elara took a spoonful. The warmth spread down her throat, thawing the ice in her chest. And then, the tears came. She didn't mean for them to, but the kindness was too much to bear. It broke her in a way the beating hadn't. She wept silently, the tears dripping into the stew. And Martha didn't tell her to stop. She didn't tell her to hush. She just rested a calloused hand on Elara's back and let her cry. That night, Elara was given a guest room upstairs. It wasn't grand. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner, and the floorboards creaked, but there was a lamp, glowing on the bedside table, casting a golden circle of light against the dark. For the first time in her life, someone had turned down a bed for her, but the moment that stayed with Elara, the moment she would remember for the rest of her life, happened just as Martha was leaving the room. The widow paused at the door. "Sleep well, Elara," she said. And then Martha turned the key in the lock, but she didn't lock it from the outside to keep Elara in. She locked it from the inside and handed the key to the girl. A door that locked for her, not against her. A barrier between her and the world that had tried to break her. The days that followed were slow and quiet. Elara healed, though the bruises on her ribs turned a terrifying shade of purple before fading to yellow. She tried to work, tried to sweep the floors or scrub the pots, but Martha would gently take the broom from her hands. "Sit," the widow would command. "You've carried enough burdens. Let this house carry you for a while." It was during these quiet afternoons, as the winter sun slanted through the windows, that Martha first mentioned him. Elara was mending a tear in one of Martha's shawls when the older woman looked out toward the high timberline, a strange, fond expression crossing her face. "My partner will be down from the high country soon," Martha said, almost to herself. Elara looked up, startled. "Your partner, Elias?" Martha said. "Elias Two-Rivers. He runs the trapping lines up in the high pines. Keeps the predators off the cattle in the winter." Elara felt a flicker of unease. Is he a hard man?" Martha chuckled. A dry, raspy sound. "The town folks think so. They cross the street when he walks into Oak Hollow. They see his Cheyenne blood and his size, and they see a wolf." She turned her gaze back to Elara, her eyes serious. "But he's the only soul I trust to watch my back. He's a good man, Elara, but a lonely one. Same as you." Elara didn't ask any more questions, but the name settled in her mind like a seed. Elias. A man the world feared. A man Martha trusted. She looked out at the snowy peaks, wondering what kind of man lived in the silence of the mountains, and whether a wolf could truly be gentle. She didn't know it yet, but the storm that had brought her to Martha was nothing compared to the quiet hurricane that was about to walk through the front door. The morning Elias Two-Rivers arrived at Double Creek Ranch, the sky was a sheet of hammered iron, gray and unforgiving. The wind had picked up, whistling through the eaves of the house with a sound that made the timbers groan. Inside, Elara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, trying to absorb its warmth. But the chill that had settled in her bones wasn't from the weather. Martha looked up from her kneading board, her flour-dusted hands pausing mid-motion. She tilted her head, listening to a sound Elara hadn't even registered: the rhythmic, heavy thud of hoofbeats on frozen ground. "That'll be Elias," Martha said, a small smile softening the deep lines of her face. She spoke his name the way one might name a gentle storm moving in from the horizon, inevitable, powerful, but nothing to fear. But Elara felt her stomach tighten into a knot. She had heard the name whispered through the house for days now. Sometimes Martha spoke it with pride, sometimes with a quiet longing, as though this man was the only thread holding the ranch together. But Elara had no reference for a man who didn't bring pain. In her world, heavy footsteps meant danger. They meant she needed to hide. She didn't know what to make of someone who was actually wanted. A few moments later, The front door opened, letting in a gust of snow and wind that swirled across the floorboards. A figure stepped inside, ducking slightly to clear the frame. He was wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide coat that made him look like a piece of the mountain itself had walked indoors. Elias Two-Rivers was a man who commanded the room simply by standing in it. He stepped inside with a quiet that felt intentional, as though he did not wish to disturb anything that did not belong to him. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a man who swung axes and hauled timber for a living. His mother had been Cheyenne, and his features carried the sharp, chiseled beauty of her people: a strong jaw, high cheekbones, and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His black hair was tied back at the nape of his neck, streaked with a few early strands of gray that made him look older than his 30-odd years. But what struck Elara most wasn't his size or his scars. It was the stillness about him, a kind of peaceful gravity that pulled the air out of the room. Elias. Martha greeted him warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's good to have you home. Good to see you, Martha," he replied. His voice was low, a deep rumble like distant thunder, steady and calm. "I came as soon as the pass cleared." He began to unbutton his heavy coat, and as he did, his eyes drifted to Elara. She froze, instinctively shrinking back against her chair. She waited for the sneer. She waited for the look of hunger, or the cruel appraisal she had received from Caleb Sterling every day for years. But Elias didn't look at her like that. His gaze was quiet, assessing, but not predatory. There was no judgment in it. He looked at her the way a tracker looks at a new ridge line or the bend of a river, simply observing what was there. He saw the bruises fading on her face. He saw the way she held her breath. And then, he simply nodded. "Ma'am," he said softly. "Elara," Martha said, stepping between them to bridge the gap. "This is Elias Two-Rivers. Elias. This is Miss Elara Vance. She's staying with us for a while." "Miss Vance," he acknowledged. Elara pressed her hands together to hide their trembling. "Sir," she whispered. They gathered at the oak table for coffee. Elias didn't speak much. He answered Martha's questions simply, offering comments only when they mattered. He seemed to listen more than most people cared to speak. Elara learned, through the gaps in the conversation, that he lived alone in a cabin in the high pines, digging for silver and running trap lines. He lived in a silence so deep most people would drown in it. A man can lose himself if he stays too close to what the world expects, he said quietly, at one point, staring into his black coffee. "I prefer the silence." Elara watched him over the rim of her cup. She saw the shadow that lived behind his eyes, a quiet ache that had settled in like winter fog. Martha had told her, in hushed tones, that Elias had been married once. Years ago, his wife had died of lung fever, and the grief had carved him in ways no one could see from a distance, but became clear the closer you drew. Later that afternoon, Elara stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug. She didn't realize Elias was there until she turned and saw him near the stable, repairing a leather bridle strap. He worked with easy, practiced motions, his hands steady despite the cold. He didn't look up when he spoke, but his voice carried clearly over the wind. "You're afraid of me." Elara nearly dropped the rug. She clutched it to her chest like a shield. I'm not. It's all right." He tightened a buckle, the leather creaking in his grip. "I've seen fear before, Miss Vance. I know what causes it." And I know the kind of men who put it there. Elara swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't mean to be rude. Mr. Two-Rivers. He sat back on his heels, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were dark, intense, but incredibly gentle. You're not being rude. You're being careful, he said. But I want you to know something. I don't want anything from you. Not now. Not ever. Unless you choose to give it. He paused, letting the words sink in. I take nothing that isn't freely given. Miss Vance. That is my vow. That last line settled deep inside her, warmer than the fire in Martha's parlor. Freely given. The concept was so foreign to her it made her dizzy. She had lived her whole life feeling like she owed the world everything, her labor, her silence, her dignity. The idea that nothing was required of her left her both relieved and deeply unsettled. I don't understand anything anymore, she admitted softly. Then, let it unfold, he said, turning back to his work. No one is chasing you here, but the world outside the ranch was not as peaceful as the world within it. That evening, after supper, the mood at the table shifted. The lamps were turned down low, and Martha folded her napkin with a sigh. Elias, she began, gently. We need to talk about Elara. Elara froze by the stove, the dish rag in her hand. Elias didn't look up from whittling a piece of cedar, but his hands stopped moving. The judge was in town today, Martha said, her voice tight, asking questions. He knows she didn't just vanish into the snow. He's looking for her, and he's angry if he finds her here. Well, a widow and a lone woman can't hold off the law, even if the law is crooked. Elias looked at the axe handle he was shaping, his thumb running over the grain of the wood. He won't stop, he said simply. Men like Sterling don't like losing things they think they own. She needs to go somewhere he won't look, Martha said. Somewhere the law doesn't reach so easily. Silence stretched between them. Elara's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She was going to be sent away. She knew it. She was a burden, a danger. Then, Elias looked up. His eyes found Elara's across the dim room. If she's willing, he said, his voice steady as bedrock. I'd like her to come with me to the high pines. To the cabin. Elara felt the room tilt. To live with you. Elias shook his head slightly. Not as a servant. Not as someone beholden. And not as a wife. Just to see if you can find some peace there. He stood then, not approaching her, giving her space. I need to live a life that's my own, he said, away from the town's eyes. But you can't build anything alone forever. Agnes is right. You need safety. I can give you that. A roof, a fire, and a loaded rifle at the door. No promises, he added softly. No demands. If you want to leave at any time, I'll bring you back here myself. I just want to see if you can breathe easier under a simpler sky. It was the kindest, most terrifying offer Elara had ever received. To go into the wild with a man she barely knew, a man the town called a wolf. But as she looked at him, standing there with his hands open and his eyes clear, she realized that the wolf was the only thing standing between her and the monsters she had left behind. I'll go, she whispered, and in that quiet agreement, a new path opened up before them, one that led straight into the heart of the mountains, where the snow was deep, and the only law was honor. The journey to the high pines was a climb into a different world. They rode higher and higher, leaving the gray slush of the valley floor behind for air that was thin, sharp, and smelled of ancient spruce. The cabin sat in a long, narrow valley, tucked away like a secret the mountain was keeping just for them. It wasn't a palace. It was a single-room structure made of rough-cut logs, with a stone chimney leaning slightly to the west and a narrow porch that looked out over a drop-off so steep it made your head spin. But to Elara, seeing it for the first time, it was more beautiful than the Sterling Manor had ever been. Not because of its size, it was barely larger than the judge's pantry, but because nothing inside those walls carried the memory of a raised hand or a hateful voice. Inside, the air smelled of cedar wood and tobacco. There was a handmade bed in the corner covered with a patchwork quilt, a small wood stove that popped and hissed, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans and river stones. "It's small," Elias said, setting her small trunk down near the door. "But it's safe." Safe. That word again. Elara was still learning how to trust it. She looked at the single bed, then back at him, panic fluttering in her chest. "There's only one bed," she whispered. Elias didn't even blink. "You take it. I'll sleep in the lean-to with the horses. Or roll a blanket out by the fire when the wind is too high." "No," Elara protested, the old instinct to shrink herself rising up. "I can't put you out of your own home. Elias, I can sleep on the floor. I'm used to it." Elias stopped her with a look, not angry, just firm. "You don't owe me anything, Elara. I want that clear. You sleep in the bed. I sleep where I can watch the door. That's the way of it." And that was how life in the high pines began. The days passed in a rhythm Elara had never known. In the town of Oak Hollow, time was measured in demands. Floors to scrub, silver to polish, insults to endure. But up here, time was measured by the light moving across the floorboards. Morning started with the crackle of the stove. Elias would be up long before her, the scent of coffee already filling the small room. He would hand her a tin cup of warm milk or coffee before stepping out to check his traps or head toward the silver claim he worked in the lower gorge. He didn't ask her to work. He didn't demand a hot meal when he returned. But Elara found she couldn't sit idle. Not because she was afraid of punishment, but because the work steadied her. She swept the rough timber floors until they were spotless. She found his torn work coats, heavy canvas, ripped by thorns and rocks, and mended them by the window light. Her stitches small and precise. It was a strange, silent dance they did. Acts of service became their language. He chopped the wood so she wouldn't have to carry the heavy logs. She kept the fire alive so he would come home to warmth. He brought her fresh water from the spring. She baked bread using the sourdough starter Martha had packed for her. They lived quietly, but not silently. And in that quiet, something tender began to root itself between them. In the afternoons, when the sun turned the snow on the peaks to blinding white, the lessons began. Back at the ranch, Martha had packed a small book of poetry, Keats and Shelley, along with the supplies. Elara had never been allowed to read for pleasure in the Sterling house. Reading was for the family, not the help. She would sit by the fire, reading the stanzas aloud, her voice growing stronger with each page. Elias would sit across from her, cleaning his rifle or oiling a trap, listening with a rapt attention that made her flush. He didn't know the poets, but he knew the rhythm of the world they described. "Read that part again," he would say softly. "The part about the wind." In exchange, He taught her the language of the mountain. He showed her how to identify the dried herbs he kept in jars: willow bark for pain, yarrow for bleeding, sage for clearing the spirit. He taught her how to read the tracks in the snow outside their door. "See here," he said one afternoon, kneeling in the drift. "The print is deep. The stride is long. Elk, moving fast." Probably spooked by a cat further up the ridge, Elara knelt beside him, tracing the shape of the hoofprint. "How do you know it was a cat?" "Because the birds are quiet," he said, looking up at the silent trees. "The mountain tells you everything. If you listen." He was teaching her to survive. Yes, but he was also teaching her that she belonged in this world, that she wasn't an intruder, but a part of the landscape. "You're learning fast," he told her one evening, a rare smile touching his eyes. "I didn't know I could," she murmured, looking at her hands. "I was always told I was slow, useless." "You were told lies," Elias said, his voice dropping to that low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "All you ever needed was a chance." Their eyes met for a moment, warm as the fire between them, and then he gently looked away, giving the moment space. He was careful with her, always careful, like she was a frightened deer that might bolt if he moved too fast. But the true turning point, the moment Elara realized she had truly left Oak Hollow behind, came on a Tuesday. She was making supper. It was a simple meal: cornmeal batter for bread and a rabbit stew from the game Elias had brought in. She was distracted, watching a hawk circle the valley through the window, and she lost track of the heat. The smell of burning hit her nose too late. Elara gasped, snatching the cast iron skillet from the stove. But the damage was done. The bottom of the cornbread was black, charred to a crisp. Smoke filled the small cabin. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her throat. In the Sterling house, a burnt meal meant a withheld meal. It meant Beatrice screaming about the cost of flour. It meant the back of a hand. She stood frozen, the skillet in her hand. Trembling, the door opened, and Elias stepped in, stomping snow from his boots. He stopped, sniffing the air. He looked at the smoke, then at the black ruin in the skillet, and finally at Alara, who was shrinking back against the wall, bracing herself for the shouting. "I'm sorry," she stammered, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Elias. I was watching the hawk, and I'll fix it. I won't eat tonight. You take the stew. Elias walked over to her. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't yell. He gently took the heavy skillet from her shaking grip and set it on the table. He took a knife, scraped the burnt black crust off the bottom, and popped a piece of the scorched bread into his mouth. He chewed thoughtfully, his face serious. Then he looked at her. "Well," he said, "it's got character." Elara blinked, stunned. "What?" "Crunchy," he added, a grin breaking across his face. A real, boyish grin she had never seen before. "I like it. Keeps the teeth sharp." A giggle bubbled up in Elara's throat. She tried to suppress it, but the relief was too strong. It escaped as a snort, then a laugh. Elias chuckled, and suddenly they were both laughing. She laughed until her sides ached, a sound she hadn't heard from herself since she was a child. She looked at him, wiping tears from her eyes, happy tears. This time, He was eating the burnt bread, smiling at her with a warmth that melted the last of the ice around her heart. In that cabin, high above the world that had rejected them both, Elara realized something profound. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She wasn't just hiding. She was living. Later that night, as the orange dusk settled behind the hills, Elias stood on the porch, watching the sky. Elara stepped out beside him, the boards creaking under her feet. "You all right?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, then looked down at her. "About whether this life is good for you. Whether you're here because you want it, or because it's the only door that opened." Elara stepped closer. The wind whipped her hair, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt the man beside her solid, honest, and kind. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, "but I know I'm safer here than I've ever been." Elias looked at her then, not with possession, not with expectation, but with a quiet gratitude. "Then we'll keep building this life slow," he said, "piece by piece. No rush, no demands." Elara nodded. For the first time, she believed him. She believed in the future. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing, easily broken by the sound of hooves. And down in the valley, the snow was beginning to melt, clearing the road for those who hunted not for meat, but for ownership. The winter was ending, and the wolves in men's clothing were beginning to stir. Late spring arrived in the high pines not with a whisper, but with the roar of the river breaking its banks. The snowmelt turned the creek behind the cabin into a torrent of white water, and the wildflowers, blue columbine and Indian paintbrush, pushed their way through the thawing earth. For a few precious weeks, Elara allowed herself to believe that the world below had forgotten her. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing, easily broken by the sound of men who feel they are owed something. It happened on a Tuesday, the air thick with the scent of sun-warmed pine. Elara was outside, scrubbing a tin pot with river sand, humming a tune Elias had taught her. She didn't hear the riders at first over the rush of the creek. It was Elias who heard them. He stepped out of the cabin, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the distant bend of the trail, where a plume of dust was rising against the blue sky. Elara stood up, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "Who is it?" she asked, though the cold pit in her stomach already knew the answer. "Trouble," Elias said quietly. 4 riders emerged from the tree line. At the front, sitting tall on a chestnut mare, was Judge Josiah Sterling. He wore a fine city coat that looked out of place against the rough timber. But his face was exactly as Elara remembered it: hard, imperious, and utterly without soul. Beside him rode the county sheriff, a man whose badge shone in the sunlight, and 2 hired hands whose hands hovered near their holsters. Elara stumbled back until her spine hit the rough logs of the cabin wall. The nightmare had climbed the mountain. The judge reined in his horse, looking around the small clearing with a sneer of distaste. "Well," he drawled, his voice carrying that practiced courtroom oiliness, "ain't this a cozy little nest?" Elias stepped off the porch. In his hands, he held his hunting rifle. He didn't aim it. Not yet. But he held it with the casual familiarity of a man who never missed. "You're far from your jurisdiction, Sterling," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Turn around." The judge laughed. A dry, cracking sound. "I'm afraid I can't do that." "Mr. Two-Rivers?" I've come to collect my property. She isn't property. Elias snapped, the muscles in his jaw jumping. And she isn't going anywhere. Oh, but she is, the judge replied. Reaching into his saddlebag, he pulled out a folded document, waving it in the air like a weapon. You see, this here is a court order granting me full legal guardianship over Miss Vance. The court has deemed her mentally unfit to care for herself. And as her guardian, I have arranged a very advantageous marriage for her. To Mr. Cornelius Thorne. Elara's blood ran cold. Thorne was a railroad tycoon, a man 3 times her age, known for burying 3 wives and expanding his empire with ruthless cruelty. The judge wasn't here to arrest her. He was here to sell her to cover his own debts. She won't go, Elias said, raising the barrel of the rifle just an inch. The sheriff stepped forward then, his hand on his revolver. Now, son, don't do something stupid. This is a legal order. You interfere, and it's kidnapping. The penalty for that is hanging. And looking at you, well, I don't think a jury would hesitate. The threat hung heavy in the mountain air. Elias didn't flinch. He looked ready to die right there on the pine needles, if it meant keeping her safe. But Elara looked at him, at the gray streaking his dark hair, at the life he had built, at the man who had taught her she was worth something. She knew, with a terrifying clarity, that if he pulled that trigger, he would swing from a gallows before the week was out. She couldn't let him be the sacrifice. Stop. Elara's voice was shaky, but loud enough to cut through the tension. She stepped away from the wall. Put the gun down. Elias looked at her, his eyes pleading. Elara. No. I can stop them. They'll kill you, she whispered. Walking past him, she stopped just inches from him, her back to the judge. I won't let you die for me. I'm not worth that much. You're worth everything, he hissed. Then let me save you this time, she said, tears hot in her eyes. She turned to the judge. I'll come. Just leave him be. The judge smiled, a triumphant, reptile thinning of his lips. A wise choice. Girl, get your things. As Elara gathered her small bundle, her heart shattering with every step, Elias stood frozen on the porch, his rifle lowered, but his knuckles white. As she walked past him toward the judge's horse, he reached out and caught her wrist. The contact was electric. Desperate, he didn't say goodbye. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered 3 words that she would hold on to like a lifeline in a storm. Watch the horizon. She mounted the horse the sheriff brought for her, and they rode out. She didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see the wolf standing alone in the clearing, watching his heart ride away. 3 days later, the bells of the Oak Hollow Church rang out with a hollow, mournful toll. The town had turned out in their Sunday best, whispering behind gloved hands. A wedding was always a spectacle, but a wedding between the judge's troubled ward and the wealthiest man in the territory was a scandal they couldn't resist. Elara stood in the vestibule, encased in a dress that cost more than she had earned in her entire life. It was heavy lace, tight at the throat, white as a shroud. It felt like a cage. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She looked less like a bride and more like a sacrifice, waiting for the knife. The organ music swelled, a dreary, pompous march. The doors opened, and the judge gripped her arm. His fingers dug into her flesh. A reminder of who owned her. "Smile," he hissed. "You're saving this family." She walked down the aisle. The faces of the townspeople blurred. She saw Beatrice in the front row, looking smug. She saw the groom, Cornelius Thorne, waiting at the altar, a man with cold, wet eyes and hands that looked like they enjoyed crushing things. Elara reached the altar. The preacher began to speak, droning on about obedience and duty. The air in the church was stifling, smelling of stale incense and old lilies. Elara felt faint. She closed her eyes, thinking of the high mountain air. "Watch the horizon," he had said. "If anyone here has just cause, why these two should not be joined." The preacher began. He never finished the sentence. The double doors at the back of the church didn't just open. They shattered. A thunderous crack echoed through the sanctuary as wood splintered and gave way. Screams erupted from the pews. Men jumped to their feet. And there, framed in the broken doorway, was a nightmare come to life. A horse, a massive roan stallion, reared on the threshold, its iron shoes striking sparks against the stone floor. And atop the beast sat Elias Two-Rivers. He was no longer the quiet man who mended fences. He was wind-torn and fierce, dust streaking his coat, his eyes blazing with a fury that swallowed the room whole. He held his rifle in one hand, the reins in the other, and he looked like a storm god of the old world. "Two-Rivers," the judge roared, his face turning purple. "Sheriff, shoot him." But the sheriff was frozen, staring down the barrel of Elias's rifle. The horse pranced into the nave, its hooves clattering loudly on the wood floor, knocking over a flower arrangement. The townspeople scrambled over pews to get away. Elias rode straight down the center aisle, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the screams. He rode until he was 10 feet from the altar. He reined the horse in hard, the animal snorting and tossing its head. He looked at the groom, who was cowering behind the pulpit. Then he looked at the judge. And finally, he looked at Elara. He didn't command her. He didn't steal her. He lowered his hand, palm open, offering her the one thing she had never truly had. "Elara." His voice boomed over the noise, steady and clear. "Choose." Time seemed to stop. Elara looked at the judge, who was lunging for her. She looked at the wealthy tyrant waiting to claim her. And then she looked at the hand of the man who had burnt his tongue on her cooking just to make her smile. She didn't hesitate. Elara grabbed heavy handfuls of her expensive lace skirt and yanked them up. She kicked off her satin shoes. She ran. She dodged the judge's grasping hand, sprinted past the gaping preacher, and reached up. Elias caught her forearm with a strength born of desperation and love. He swung her up behind him in a single and a two fluid. "Hold on," he shouted. Elara wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat. It smelled of pine and horses and freedom. Elias kicked the stallion. The horse wheeled around, knocking over a row of hymnals, and bolted back down the aisle. As they flew past the broken doors and out into the blinding sunlight, Elara heard the judge screaming curses behind them. But his voice sounded small. It sounded far away. They galloped down the main street of Oak Hollow, leaving the scandal and the shame in the dust. They rode toward the open plains, toward the mountains, toward a horizon that was finally, truly theirs. The shouts of the judge and his men faded into the wind, lost in the labyrinth of canyons that Elias knew by heart, while the hired hands scrambled behind them. disorganized and lost. Elias cut west, guiding the roan stallion toward a sanctuary no map would ever show. They didn't stop until they reached a high ridge, looking out over the endless, rolling plains of the untamed west, where the golden grass rose in waves under the late sun. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a peace Elara had never known. Elias helped her down from the horse. He didn't check for pursuers. He only looked at her. He took her face in his rough, gentle hands, wiping away the dust of the road. "No one owns you," he whispered, his voice steady as the mountains beneath them. "No one ever will again." And there, beneath a sky wide enough to hold all their dreams, he kissed her. It was a promise, sealed not in paper or law, but in freedom. Seasons passed. The small cabin in the high pines grew, a room added here, a garden planted there. The silence was eventually replaced by the soft laughter of a daughter they named Grace. A child born not in fear, but in hope. The final picture we have of Elara isn't of a maid scrubbing floors, but of a woman standing on her porch, watching the sun set over a land that she claimed with the man who never let her go. She was finally, truly free. And that, folks, is where we leave them. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Elara's choice. Would you have taken that leap of faith? Let me know in the comments below. And tell me where you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing how far our community stretches across the map. If this story touched your spirit, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a new beginning. And make sure you're subscribed to the Dust Trail for more tales from the frontier. Until next time, keep your fires bright and your eyes on the horizon.